On February 4th, 1992, a group of mid-ranking Venezuelan military officers tried to take power. But in the end, they failed. Before noon, one of the commanders of the coup, Lieutenant Colonel Hugo Chávez, surrendered and gave a live television address ordering his fellow conspirators across the country to lay down their arms.
Compañeros, lamentablemente, por ahora, los objetivos que nos planteamos no fueron logrados en la ciudad capital.
This transmission catapulted the unknown officer into the national spotlight. But in that moment, Chávez did something that no one expected. He didn't just surrender. He left a message.
Por ahora.
Por ahora. For now. But this story didn't start in 1992. It started years earlier, under a tree in the Venezuelan llanos, a tree older than the republic itself. For centuries, a colossal tree watched over the grasslands of what is today Venezuela. This tree was known as the Samán de Güere. Its enormous branches stretched into the sky above the tropical plains and reached the height of a 6-story building. According to legend, it stood for up to 600 years, its canopy so wide that 1,000 men could stand beneath its shade. It watched as Venezuela was born, as empires came and went. And according to legend, even Simón Bolívar once rested beneath its shade, as he fought to liberate South America from the Spanish Empire. And then, almost 200 years later, 5 young soldiers stood beneath that same tree in December of 1982. Among them, a young officer named Hugo Chávez. The 5 men made an oath beneath the ancient giant. I swear by the gods of my fathers, I swear by my country, I swear by my honor, that I will not give peace to my soul nor rest to my arm until I see the chains broken that oppress my people by the will of the powerful. Free elections, free lands, free men, horror to the oligarchy. From that moment on, this was no longer a group of officers. It was a conspiracy, a secret movement inside the Venezuelan armed forces, the beginning of what would become El Movimiento Bolivariano Revolucionario, the Revolutionary Bolivarian Movement, founded in 1982 with one objective: to overthrow the system. And at the center of all of it was an idea, that Venezuela had been betrayed, that power had been captured by an elite few, and that the only institution that had the force to take it back was the military. 10 years later, on February 4th, 1992, they made their move. The day before, February 3rd, Venezuelan President Carlos Andrés Pérez was scheduled to land at Maiquetía International Airport. His Interior Minister, Virgilio Ávila Vivas, had been asked to meet him on arrival. But when he got there, something was off. The Defense Minister, General Ochoa Antich, was also on the runway. That was unusual, very unusual. Even the president was surprised to see him there. As they made their way towards Caracas, the defense minister finally spoke. There are rumors of a conspiracy within the military, Mr. President. Rumors like this had been circulating for years, so the matter didn't seem new or urgent. But the president scheduled a meeting with the high command of the armed forces early the next morning. He wanted answers and planned to put these rumors to rest once and for all. But by then, it would already be too late, because the coup was already underway. Late into the night, on February 3rd, the conspirators moved with precision. They had the element of surprise on their side. Across the country, they struck their targets. The same men who had sworn their oath beneath the Samán de Güere were now taking control of military bases, cities, and entire states. In the west, near the Colombian border, Lieutenant Colonel Francisco Arias Cárdenas seized control of Zulia. This was the most populous state in the country and the center of Venezuela's oil wealth. The elected governor was taken hostage. Arias Cárdenas declared himself military governor and went on the radio to announce that the military had taken control in the name of the people. Closer to the capital, in the cities of Valencia and Maracay, more key military bases fell to the rebels. The operation was working. But everything depended on one place: Caracas, the capital, the seat of political power. The mission was simple: capture the president, take the city, and seize power. As rebel forces advanced outside the capital, a military convoy was making its way to Caracas. At its head was none other than Hugo Chávez. In the capital, near 12 a.m., President Pérez had arrived at La Casona, the presidential residence, when he received the call. The state of Zulia had fallen. It was the moment when he realized what was happening. These weren't just rumors. This was a coup. He immediately left for Miraflores, the presidential palace, and just as his car left the residence, the rebels arrived. They missed him by a matter of minutes. If he hadn't left when he did, the coup might have succeeded right then and there. Fighting broke out over control of La Casona as gunfire and mortars hit the residence. At one point, the officer in charge of defending the president's family considered surrendering. But the First Lady, Blanca Rodriguez, a strong-willed Venezuelan woman like any other, picked up a machine gun and, refusing to abandon their position, warned that she would defend the residence if he didn't. Meanwhile, at the presidential palace, the situation remained unclear. Who were the rebels? How many of them were there? And what bases and cities had fallen? Soon, the scale of the coup became clear. 10 battalions had risen up against the government across 5 states, including some of the army's most powerful units. Then, the attack on the palace began. Bullets struck the president's office, and the president took cover. Rebel forces and the Presidential Honor Guard exchanged fire. The palace was under siege. President Perez then made a decision. He had to get out. Around 1 a.m., he escaped through a tunnel beneath Miraflores that took him from his office to the parking lot. From there, he went straight to the TV station owned by Venevisión, the country's largest network at the time. There, President Perez addressed the nation.
Me dirijo a toda la nación porque se acaba de producir.
He condemned the coup, defended the Constitution, and made one thing clear. He was still alive and in control. That changed everything. The rebels had failed to capture the president, and without that, the coup began to collapse. By 2 a.m., Perez appeared again on TV, this time surrounded by politicians and military leaders, a sign of unity and control. Again, he ordered the rebels to surrender. By 4 a.m. in Caracas, they had begun to lay down their arms. But Chávez was still out there. He had taken position at a military complex on a hill above the capital, a strategic location he intended to use as a command center. But something had gone wrong. The rebels had never established proper communications, which meant that they were isolated, disorganized, cut off from each other during the operation. It took hours, but eventually Chávez surrendered. The crisis wasn't over though, because in Zulia, Maracay, and Valencia, the rebels were still in control. The government now faced a dilemma. How could they end this without further bloodshed? The solution they came up with was to let Chávez speak. He had convinced the military leadership to let him go on television, telling them that his men would listen to him if he asked them to surrender. And that's when it happened, one of the most important speeches in modern Venezuelan history, delivered by a man who no one knew just hours before. He told his comrades to surrender, but he didn't just surrender. He said that they had failed por ahora, for now, suggesting to the country that despite their defeat, the movement would continue. And with that, the rebellion ended. But something else had just begun. Overnight, Hugo Chávez became a national celebrity, a folk hero among some of the poorest sectors of society, and a figure of ridicule for many in the upper classes. A few weeks later, during the week-long Carnaval holiday, many citizens dressed up like Chávez in his paratrooper uniform and iconic red beret. Some did so to honor him, others to mock him, running around repeating, por ahora, por ahora, por ahora. The day before, no one knew his name. The day after, everyone in Venezuela knew his face. Ironically, Chávez had failed. He had failed to capture the president, he had failed to take Caracas, he had failed to take power. Chávez had lost. But what he did win were the hearts and minds of thousands. But why did the coup fail? Hundreds of pages have been written about this, but in the end, it came down to a few key factors. The first was communication. For reasons that are still not entirely clear, the rebels failed to set up the antennas that were supposed to connect the insurgent units in Caracas. The building Chávez had taken over was meant to serve as a command center, a communications hub for the rebel forces in the capital. But without that system, the insurgents couldn't coordinate their actions. Their initial advantage, the confusion and surprise of the early morning hours, slowly disappeared. The longer it took to capture their main targets, La Casona and Miraflores, the less prepared they were to adapt. And without communications, there was no real way to improvise. The second reason was that key parts of the plan never materialized. The conspirators had expected support from sectors of the Venezuelan Air Force, including several officers and at least one general, but when the moment came, those officers never joined the uprising. As a result, the rebels had virtually no air power. They had also counted on civilians taking to the streets and rallying behind the coup. That never happened either, perhaps because by the moment the rebels failed to capture the president, the coup was already doomed. And then there's the third factor. The conspirators may have been betrayed. This is one of the most fascinating parts of the story, because it raises more questions than it answers. One of the officers involved in the conspiracy was reportedly engaged to the daughter of the director of the military academy. According to several accounts, he told his future father-in-law about the plot the day before the coup. But if that's true, why weren't the conspirators arrested the day before? How were they still able to seize so many military bases, so many cities, and come so close to capturing the president? My own view is that this says less about the rebels and more about the system that they were trying to overthrow. The director of the military academy reportedly tried to warn the general who was the head of the army, but the general made him wait for hours before meeting with him, and when he finally did, he seemed to have concluded that removing the batteries from a few tanks and perhaps informing the defense minister was enough. That would explain why the defense minister showed up unexpectedly to the airport to greet the president. That's likely why he warned about rumors of a coup. He just didn't believe that the conspirators were actually capable of pulling it off. And in many ways, that attitude captures everything that had gone wrong with Venezuela's political system. By 1992, the military high command had become an extension of the same political elite that had monopolized power in Venezuela for decades. These were men who lived lavishly, advanced through connections and patronage, and often behaved more like politicians than soldiers. They were deeply tied to the governing parties, skilled at maneuvering within the political system, and like much of Venezuela's political class, they had become arrogant and complacent. They no longer believed anyone could seriously challenge the order that they had built. That was their greatest mistake. Because in many ways, Chávez and his fellow conspirators were right. Venezuela was in crisis, and it had been in crisis for years. For almost 4 decades, after the fall of the last military dictatorship in 1958, Venezuela had been one of the most stable democracies in a Latin America governed by military dictatorships. There were elections, political parties competed for power, and when they lost, they stepped aside peacefully. Everything a democracy is supposed to have. But something was missing. Accountability. Because over time, the system began to close in on itself. The two parties that had dominated the new democracy, Acción Democrática and COPEI, came to control everything. They didn't just compete for power, they shared it, juggled it between their interests. And slowly, Venezuela became a country run by the parties, for the parties. A partyocracy. And if you wanted something from the state, a job, housing, resources, you didn't go through state institutions, you went through one of the two parties. And if you weren't part of the party system, you were practically invisible. The result was predictable. Corruption spread and power concentrated. The distance between the political class and the Venezuelan people grew wider and wider. A new economic elite gained direct access to power. Businessmen, wealthy families, and insiders who used their connections to win government contracts, bend the rules, and protect their interests. In the 1980s, oil prices collapsed and the economy went into crisis. But the system built around the two parties didn't know how to respond. It was too rigid, too corrupt, and too disconnected. And the consequences of that were devastating. Poverty and inequality exploded. By the 1990s, nearly half the country was living in poverty. And none of this was a secret. By the late 1980s, both ordinary Venezuelans and the political class knew something was deeply wrong. There was a growing sense that the system had to change, that citizens needed more of a voice, and that the old political order could not continue as it was. In 1984, just 1 year after Chávez and his fellow officers swore their oath beneath the Samán de Güere, President Jaime Lucinchi created the Comisión para la Reforma del Estado, or COPRE. It was a presidential commission with a mission to modernize the state, decentralize power, and reform Venezuela's political system. But as history often shows us, systemic change can be difficult, especially when the people who benefit from the system are the ones being asked to change it. The crisis was moving faster than the political class's willingness to react. The boat was sinking, and the people at the top still believed that everything was under control. It's in that context that we have to understand the coup of February 4th, 1992. In the aftermath of the coup, the government scrambled to restore order. The conspirators were arrested and sent to prison, and the next day, Congress convened a session to address the situation. The political class wanted unity. The parties had agreed to skip the debate, pass a resolution condemning the coup, and move on. But then one man stood up and gave an impassioned speech that changed the conversation. Former President Rafael Caldera.
Es difícil pedirle al pueblo que se inmole.
It's difficult to ask the Venezuelan people to sacrifice themselves for freedom and democracy when they believe that freedom and democracy cannot feed them, when freedom and democracy have not been able to stop the relentless rise in the cost of living, when freedom and democracy have not been able to put an end to the terrible, corrosive corruption that is consuming Venezuela's institutions in the eyes of the world. This reality cannot be hidden. The military coup is condemnable, absolutely condemnable, in every sense. But it would be naive to believe that this was simply the reckless adventure of a few ambitious men who did not understand what they were doing.
Hay un entorno, hay un mar de fondo.
There is a climate in this country, an undercurrent, a deep and serious crisis. And if we do not confront it, destiny will have very grave consequences in store for Venezuela. Now, Rafael Caldera was a seasoned politician. Some people believed he was using the crisis to position himself for a return to power. And perhaps he was, because 2 years later, he would become president again. But regardless of his motives, Caldera understood something important. Coups like this don't come from nowhere. They emerge when institutions stop working, when people stop believing in them. They're a natural consequence of when a political system becomes incapable of reforming itself. And if anyone still doubted that Venezuela was in crisis, they wouldn't have to wait long. 9 months later, there was another coup. This time, it came from the Air Force. The same officers who had been expected to join Chávez in February, but never did. They seized military aircraft and bombed several targets in the capital, and for a moment it looked as though the country might collapse into some kind of civil war. But once again, the coup failed. 2 loyalist F-16s confronted the rebel aircraft in the skies above Caracas. By the end of the day, 171 people were dead. It was the bloodiest battle ever fought in Venezuelan skies. 2 military coups in less than a year. Perhaps the clearest sign of all that something was breaking inside the Venezuelan state. The country was losing faith in its government, its parties, and its institutions. And that's also why Chávez's words, por ahora, resonated so deeply. Because in a country where no one ever seemed willing to take responsibility, Chávez did. He looked directly into the camera in spite of his defeat, and he said,
Y yo, ante el país y ante ustedes, asumo la responsabilidad de este movimiento militar bolivariano.
I assume responsibility before you and the country. He had failed, but unlike the political class, he admitted it. And for many Venezuelans, that made a huge difference. For now, Chávez and his fellow conspirators were in prison, but soon they would achieve their goals, this time through elections, from within the system itself. But before we can understand how Chávez finally came to power, we have to understand how Venezuela got here, how a country with the largest oil reserves in the world became trapped in a cycle of crisis. Because the Venezuelan military didn't just intervene in politics. In many ways, it created the modern Venezuelan state. In the next episode, we go back to the beginning, to the soldiers, generals, and caudillos who built Venezuela, to the political forces that overthrew them, and to the democratic system that, for a time, seemed to have finally broken the long cycle of military rule. Until 1998, when Venezuelans elected a former coup leader as their president.